The traffic light turned red, and Harold Chen pulled his old sedan to a stop. At 63, with a belly that pressed against the steering wheel and sweat stains darkening his wrinkled shirt, he looked like a man defeated by life itself. The afternoon sun blazed through the windshield, making the car's broken air conditioner feel like a cruel joke. Harold wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, glancing at the dashboard where a faded photo of his late wife smiled back at him. 3 years since the cancer took her. 3 years since his restaurant closed. 3 years since he'd felt anything resembling purpose. He reached for the lukewarm coffee in the cup holder, his fingers trembling slightly, a side effect of the medication he could barely afford. That's when he saw her. A young woman, maybe 25, stood at the corner with a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps, God bless." Her clothes hung loose on her thin frame, and her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. But it wasn't her appearance that made Harold's chest tighten, it was her eyes. Even from this distance, even through the grime on his windshield, he could see something in those eyes that reminded him of his daughter before she'd stopped returning his calls. The light seemed to take forever to change, and Harold found himself unable to look away from the young woman as she approached other cars, each rejection adding another layer of defeat to her shoulders. Before we continue with this story, I need you to do me a favor. If this beginning caught your attention, if you want to know what happens next, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel brings you real stories about real people, the kind of encounters that remind us we're all connected in ways we never expect. And tell me, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments below. I love knowing where my viewers are joining me from, whether you're in New York, Los Angeles, São Paulo, London, or a small town nobody's heard of. Your city matters. Your story matters. Now back to Harold and this young woman whose paths were about to cross in a way that would change everything. Harold had spent the last 3 years becoming invisible. After Margaret died, after the restaurant failed, after his daughter Emma stopped answering his calls, he'd perfected the art of blending into the background. He drove for a rideshare company now, picking up strangers who rarely looked at him, treating him like a mobile phone holder with legs. The weight he'd gained seemed to make him even more invisible, as if his expanding belly was nature's way of erasing him from the world. He'd become exactly what society expected of an old, overweight man, forgettable, dismissible, already gone. But something about this young woman at the traffic light wouldn't let him slip back into that comfortable invisibility. The light turned green, but Harold didn't move. Cars behind him started honking, their impatience cutting through the humid air. The young woman had been rejected by the car in front of him, and was now walking back toward the corner, her sign drooping in her hands. Harold's foot hovered over the gas pedal. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to drive on, to mind his business, to remember that he barely had enough money for his own medications. The honking grew louder, more aggressive. Someone shouted something crude out their window. The young woman looked up at the commotion, and for a brief second her eyes met Harold's through the windshield. In that moment, Harold saw something he recognized, something he'd seen in his own mirror every morning for 3 years. It was the look of someone drowning in plain sight, surrounded by people who refused to see them sinking. He saw her mouth move, forming what might have been an apology for causing the traffic jam. That's when Harold made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of driving forward, he rolled down his passenger window and gestured for her to come closer. The cars behind him erupted in a symphony of horns and curses. Someone tried to swerve around him, middle finger raised high, but Harold kept his eyes on the young woman, who stood frozen on the corner, clearly unsure if this old man in the beaten sedan was offering help or something sinister. He could see her calculating, weighing her desperation against her caution. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds, she took a tentative step toward his car. Then another. And Harold realized that whatever happened next, he'd just made his first real choice in 3 years. The honking continued, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and an old man with nothing left to lose waited for a young woman with nothing left to hope for to decide whether she'd trust him. Her name was Maya Rodriguez, and she'd been on the streets for 7 months. Not that she told Harold all this right away. When she finally reached his passenger window, her fingers gripped her cardboard sign so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Up close, Harold could see the dirt under her fingernails, the sunburn on her cheeks, the way her lips were cracked from dehydration. He could also see the intelligence in her eyes, the kind that spoke of a life derailed rather than a life never launched. Harold reached across the passenger seat and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill from his glove compartment. It was money he'd been saving for his blood pressure medication, but looking at Maya, he couldn't remember why pills had seemed so important 5 minutes ago. He held it out to her through the window, expecting her to take it and disappear into the city like a ghost. That's what usually happened in these brief encounters between the comfortable and the desperate. A transaction, a moment of eased conscience, then back to separate worlds. But Maya didn't take the money. Instead, she looked at it, then at Harold, then back at the $20 bill, as if it were a test she didn't know how to pass. The honking behind them had reached a fever pitch, and someone was now leaning on their horn continuously, creating a sound that felt like it might split the world in half. Maya glanced back at the angry traffic, then leaned down to Harold's window level. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, probably from dehydration and too many days of breathing in exhaust fumes. She said something that Harold couldn't quite hear over the noise, so he told her to get in the car. He surprised himself with the words, but once they were out, he couldn't take them back. Maya's eyes widened, and Harold could see her entire body tense up, ready to bolt. He realized how this must look, an old heavy-set man in a beat-up car asking a vulnerable young woman to get inside. In her position, he would have run. He almost told her to forget it, to just take the money and go. But something made him try one more time. He pointed to the photo of Margaret on his dashboard, then held up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of harmlessness. The continuous horn behind them suddenly stopped, replaced by the sound of a car door slamming and heavy footsteps approaching. An angry man in a business suit was storming toward Harold's car, his face purple with rage. Harold locked eyes with Maya one more time, and in that split second she made her decision. She opened the passenger door and slid into the seat just as the business suit man reached Harold's window, already shouting about inconsiderate drivers and how some people shouldn't be allowed on the road. Harold didn't hear the rest of the man's rant because he was already pulling away from the intersection, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. For the first few blocks, neither of them spoke. Maya sat pressed against the passenger door, her cardboard sign clutched to her chest like a shield, her eyes darting between Harold and the street outside, as if calculating when to jump out of the moving vehicle. Harold kept both hands on the steering wheel, very aware of how this situation could be misinterpreted, very aware that he had no actual plan beyond this moment. The air conditioning might have been broken, but he could still smell the unmistakable scent of someone who'd been living rough, sweat, dirt, and something else that spoke of too many nights without shelter. He'd noticed she wasn't wearing shoes, just socks that had once been white, but were now a mottled grey and brown. Her feet must have been burning on the hot pavement before she got in his car. Harold cleared his throat, trying to figure out what to say that wouldn't sound threatening or patronizing. He'd spent 3 years in near silence, and now that words were required, he found himself tongue-tied like a nervous teenager. Maya beat him to it, her voice cutting through the awkward silence with a directness that caught him off guard. She asked where he was taking her, and her tone made it clear she was ready to throw herself out of the car if she didn't like the answer. Harold told her the truth. He had no idea. He hadn't thought that far ahead. This answer seemed to confuse Maya more than any lie would have. She studied his profile as he drove, this old man with his sweating face and his big belly and his shaking hands, trying to figure out what his angle was. Everyone had an angle. 7 months on the streets had taught her that much. People didn't help without expecting something in return, and the ones who seemed the nicest often wanted the most. But Harold just kept driving, seemingly as lost about what to do next as she was. They stopped at another red light, this one without the drama of the last. Harold could see a coffee shop on the corner, one of those chains that promised free Wi-Fi and air conditioning and normalcy. Before he could second-guess himself, he asked Maya if she was hungry. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Maya's stomach answered before she could, growling loudly enough to be heard over the engine. She looked embarrassed, angry even, as if her body had betrayed her by revealing her desperation. Harold took this as a yes and pulled into the coffee shop parking lot. As he turned off the engine, Maya finally spoke again, asking the question that had been sitting between them since she got in the car. What did he want from her? Harold turned to look at her directly for the first time since she'd gotten in the car, and Maya saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected to see. It wasn't lust or pity or the calculating look of someone planning to exploit her vulnerability. It was something closer to recognition, as if he saw in her a mirror of something he knew too well. He told her he didn't want anything, that he just couldn't drive away. It was a simple answer, maybe too simple, and Maya didn't know whether to believe it. But her stomach was growling again. The air conditioning in the parked car was already fading, and the coffee shop looked like an oasis of normalcy she hadn't experienced in what felt like lifetimes. She made a calculation that people in desperate situations make every day. The risk of trusting this strange old man versus the certainty of another hungry night on the streets. She chose risk, opening her car door and stepping out onto the hot pavement, her dirty socks immediately absorbing the heat. Harold got out too, moving slowly, his bad knee protesting as always. He gestured toward the coffee shop entrance, and together, this unlikely pair walked across the parking lot. If anyone inside the coffee shop found their appearance odd, a heavy-set old man in a sweat-stained shirt and a young homeless woman carrying a cardboard sign, they didn't show it. Or maybe they did, and Harold was just too focused on Maya to notice the looks. They found a corner booth, the vinyl seats sticky in the summer heat. Harold ordered for both of them. Coffee, sandwiches, water, a slice of cake that Maya's eyes had lingered on in the display case. While they waited for the food, Harold finally learned her name. Maya Rodriguez, 26 years old, former nursing student. The details came out slowly, reluctantly, as if each piece of her story cost something to reveal. She'd been 3 semesters away from graduation when her mother got sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Maya had dropped out to take care of her, burning through her savings, then her credit, then her housing. Her mother died on a Tuesday morning in a county hospital, and Maya found herself suddenly alone in a city where rent cost 3 times what anyone could reasonably afford. The social services were backed up for months. The shelters were full. Her friends, the few she had, offered couches for a week or 2 before the offers dried up. People got tired of other people's problems. Harold listened without interrupting, and as Maya talked, he felt something inside him crack open, something he'd kept sealed tight for 3 years. When she finished her story, which she cut off abruptly as if embarrassed by how much she'd revealed, their food arrived. Maya ate like someone who wasn't sure when the next meal would come, and Harold found himself pushing his own sandwich toward her halfway through. They sat in that coffee shop booth for 2 hours, and by the time they left, Harold had made another decision that surprised him. Harold's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator had been broken for 6 months, which meant he had to climb stairs that left him wheezing by the 2nd landing. Maya followed him up, still clutching her cardboard sign, still ready to run if necessary. When Harold unlocked his door and gestured for her to enter, Maya hesitated one more time on the threshold, but the apartment that greeted her wasn't what she'd expected. It was clean, almost obsessively so, with family photos covering every available wall space. A worn couch faced a small television. The kitchen was tiny but organized. Everything about the space spoke of someone trying to maintain order in a life that had lost its moorings. Harold showed her the bathroom and gave her a clean towel, telling her to take as long as she needed. He even dug out some of his late wife's clothes, items he'd been meaning to donate for 3 years but could never quite bring himself to part with. Seeing them now in Maya's hands felt both wrong and right in ways he couldn't explain. While Maya showered, Harold sat on his couch and wondered what he was doing. He had barely enough money to support himself. His health was declining. His daughter hadn't called in 8 months. He was in no position to help anyone, let alone a stranger he'd met at a traffic light. But as he heard the water running, imagining Maya washing away months of street grime, he felt something he hadn't felt since Margaret died. Useful. When Maya emerged from the bathroom 45 minutes later, transformed by soap and clean clothes, Harold barely recognized her. Without the dirt and desperation, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Her wet hair hung down her back, and Margaret's old summer dress fit her thin frame perfectly. She stood awkwardly in the bathroom doorway, as if unsure what the protocol was for this situation. Harold had made tea, a habit from his restaurant days, and he poured her a cup without asking if she wanted it. They sat at his small kitchen table, the evening light filtering through his dusty windows. Harold explained his situation. He was a rideshare driver, barely making ends meet. His apartment was small. He had no grand plan or hidden agenda, but his couch pulled out into a bed, and she could stay there until she figured out her next move. No strings attached, no expectations. Maya stared at him across the table, trying to understand what kind of person did this. In her experience, kindness always came with a price tag, and she was waiting for Harold to name his. But he just sipped his tea and told her about Margaret, about his daughter Emma, who'd moved to Seattle and stopped calling, about his restaurant that had served the best dumplings in the neighborhood until the rent got too high and the customers stopped coming. He talked about feeling invisible, about mornings when he couldn't remember why he bothered getting out of bed. And as he talked, Maya realized something. This old man wasn't saving her. He was saving himself. The first week was awkward, full of careful politeness and unspoken boundaries. Maya slept on the pull-out couch, always making it up perfectly before Harold woke. She used only what she needed, taking shorter showers than Harold did, eating less than her share. It was as if she was trying to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible, still not quite believing this arrangement was real. Harold went about his routine, driving for the rideshare app during peak hours, shopping at the discount grocery store, taking his medications that he could now afford again because Maya had insisted on giving him back that $20 plus interest from the coffee shop. They orbited each other like planets in separate solar systems, occupying the same space without really touching. But slowly, things began to shift. It started with small things. Maya began cleaning the apartment, not because Harold asked, but because she needed to feel useful. She reorganized his kitchen, making it more efficient based on what she'd learned from her mother's cooking. She noticed Harold's limp and asked about his knee, then showed him some stretches she'd learned in nursing school that might help. Harold, in turn, started cooking dinner for both of them, real meals instead of the frozen dinners he'd been living on. He taught Maya how to make dumplings, Margaret's recipe that he'd memorized but hadn't made in years. They fell into a rhythm, this odd pair, finding comfort in routine. Maya started applying for jobs online using Harold's laptop, though most required an address she didn't officially have and references she couldn't provide. Harold drove his routes and tried not to think about what would happen when Maya found her footing and moved on. One evening, about 2 weeks into their arrangement, Emma called. Harold's daughter reaching out for the first time in months. He answered the phone with shaking hands, and Maya discreetly moved to her corner of the apartment, giving him privacy. The conversation was brief, stilted. Emma was doing well, she said. Work was busy. She was sorry she hadn't called. She would try to do better. The usual script of estranged family members maintaining the bare minimum of connection. Harold hung up feeling worse than before she'd called, and Maya saw it on his face immediately. She asked if he was okay, and Harold found himself telling her the truth. His daughter was ashamed of him, ashamed of his failure, his weight, his reduced circumstances. She'd been Daddy's little girl once back when he owned the restaurant and had money and respect. But poverty had a way of burning away those bonds, leaving only the embarrassment of association. Maya listened to Harold's confession about Emma, and she recognized the pain in his voice because she'd felt it herself. Before her mother got sick, before everything fell apart, Maya had been someone. She'd been a nursing student with a future, with friends who invited her to parties, with a boyfriend who talked about getting a place together. But poverty had stripped all that away, revealing who really cared and who had just been along for the ride when things were good. She told Harold about her old friends who stopped returning texts, about the boyfriend who'd promised to help, but disappeared the week after her mother's funeral. She told him about the shame of asking for help, the way it diminished you in your own eyes and everyone else's. They stayed up late that night, sharing stories of loss and disappointment, finding comfort in the fact that someone else understood. Something shifted between them after that conversation. They were no longer just a good Samaritan and a charity case. They were two people who'd been discarded by a world that only valued you when you were winning. Over the next few weeks, they built something that resembled a family, or at least the shadow of one. Maya got a part-time job at a convenience store, overnight shifts that paid minimum wage but gave her a foothold back into legitimate society. Harold started driving more hours, pushing through the pain in his knee, saving money and a coffee can in the kitchen. They had a shared, unspoken goal: get Maya into her own place, Get her back on her feet, give her a second chance at the life she'd lost. But the more time they spent together, the less urgent that goal seemed to become. They watched television together in the evenings, Maya explaining modern shows to Harold, Harold sharing old movies that Maya had never heard of. She helped him with his medication schedule, using her nursing school knowledge to make sure he was taking everything correctly. He taught her how to drive his car, patient through her jerky starts and stops, giving her a skill she'd never learned growing up in a city with public transportation. They celebrated small victories, Maya's first paycheck, Harold's best tip of the week, the day his knee hurt less than usual. They commiserated over setbacks, the apartment application that rejected Maya for lack of rental history, Harold's rideshare app rating dropping because a drunk passenger complained. One morning, about 2 months into their arrangement, Harold woke up to the smell of dumplings cooking. Maya had gotten up early and made breakfast using his late wife's recipe, getting it almost perfect. He sat at the kitchen table, watching this young woman who'd been a stranger at a traffic light, now moving comfortably around his kitchen, and he felt something dangerous. Hope. Hope that this arrangement might last. Hope that maybe he didn't have to be invisible anymore. Hope that maybe they could build something real from the ruins of their separate disasters. But hope, Harold knew from experience, was a precarious thing. It built you up just high enough to make the fall hurt more. And neither of them knew it yet, but a fall was coming. The trouble started with a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, official-looking, from the apartment building management. Harold opened it with Maya looking over his shoulder, both of them already knowing it couldn't be good news. Official letters never were. The building had been sold to a development company. Everyone needed to vacate within 60 days. The developer was planning to gut-renovate the entire structure, turning the modest apartments into luxury units with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that none of the current tenants could afford. Harold read the letter 3 times, hoping the words would change. They didn't. 60 days to find a new place in a city where rents had doubled since he'd moved into this apartment 15 years ago. 60 days with his bad credit and limited income, and a roommate he couldn't explain on any official application. Maya saw the color drain from Harold's face, and she felt her own stomach drop. She'd just started to feel stable, just started to believe that maybe she could rebuild her life from this foundation. Now that foundation was crumbling, and she realized how precarious everything had been all along. They'd been living in a bubble, pretending they were secure when they were really just one letter away from disaster. Harold spent that evening calling every landlord in their price range, which wasn't many. Most places wanted first month, last month, and security deposit, an upfront cost that might as well have been $1 million. The few that might have considered Harold balked when he mentioned Maya, asking uncomfortable questions about their relationship, making assumptions that made Harold's face burn. By the end of the week, they'd seen 6 apartments. 2 were barely habitable with mold and broken windows. 3 were in neighborhoods where Harold's car wouldn't last a week without being stripped for parts. The 6th was almost acceptable, but the landlord took one look at Harold's credit score and Maya's lack of rental history and shook his head before they'd even finished the tour. Maya started picking up extra shifts at the convenience store, working until she was so exhausted she could barely stand. Harold pushed himself to drive longer hours, ignoring his knee, skipping medications to save money. They were both chasing the same impossible goal, scraping together enough money to afford first, last, and security on a place that would accept them both. But the math didn't work. It never worked for people in their situation. The city was full of people like them, scrambling for scraps, and there weren't enough scraps to go around. One night, 3 weeks after the letter arrived, Maya brought up the option they'd both been avoiding. She could go back to the streets, she said. Let Harold find a place for himself, somewhere smaller, cheaper, something he could afford alone. She said it matter-of-factly, as if she were suggesting they switch brands of coffee, but Harold heard the resignation underneath. He'd heard that tone before, in Margaret's voice near the end when she'd tried to talk about hospice, about letting go. Harold refused immediately, more vehemently than he'd intended. They'd figure something out, he insisted. They'd find a place. Maya didn't argue, but Harold saw the look in her eyes. She'd been through this before, the slow realization that sometimes there were no good options, just varying degrees of bad. She was already preparing herself for the streets again, already rebuilding the emotional walls she'd let down over the past 2 months. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He lay on his bed, listening to Maya's quiet breathing from the couch, and felt a fury building in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Fury at a system that discarded people like trash. Fury at a daughter who'd abandoned him. Fury at himself for being old and poor and useless. And underneath the fury, something more dangerous. Desperation. The idea came to Harold at 3 a.m, in that dark hour when bad decisions can look like solutions. The restaurant equipment. When his place had closed, he'd sold most of it to pay off debts, but he'd kept some items in a storage unit, telling himself he might open another restaurant someday. It was a lie he'd maintained for 3 years, paying the monthly storage fee even when he could barely afford food. That equipment had to be worth something, maybe enough for a deposit on an apartment. The storage facility was on the outskirts of the city, in an industrial area that looked even more depressing in the early morning light. Harold drove there the next day with Maya in the passenger seat, both of them quiet with cautious hope. When Harold unlocked the storage unit, pulling up the metal door, they were greeted by the musty smell of disuse and a collection of equipment that looked more like junk than salvation. There was the professional rice cooker that had made perfect rice for 15 years, the wok station that Harold had used to create his signature dishes, shelving units, cutting boards, an industrial mixer, all of it gathering dust, relics of a life that felt impossibly distant now. Maya walked through the storage unit, running her hands over the equipment, and Harold could see her making calculations. Her nursing school had taught her to be practical, to assess situations objectively. She turned to him with the verdict written on her face before she spoke. This wasn't worth as much as they needed. Maybe a few $100s if they were lucky. Not enough for a deposit. Not enough to save them. Harold felt something break inside him. This equipment represented the last tangible piece of his old life. The last thing that proved he'd once been somebody. And it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. He sat down heavily on an old storage crate, feeling every one of his 63 years, feeling the weight of his failure pressing down on his already burdened shoulders. Maya sat beside him, not touching but close, and they stayed there in silence among the ghosts of Harold's former life. After a while, Maya spoke. She had an idea, she said, though she wasn't sure Harold would go for it. She'd been thinking about it for a while, even before the eviction letter. What if they didn't try to recreate what they'd lost? What if they tried something new? Maya explained her plan. They could use this equipment to start a food cart. Nothing fancy, just dumplings and simple dishes. Maya had been researching the permits and regulations during her breaks at the convenience store. It was doable, barely, if they pooled everything they had, and Harold taught her how to cook his recipes. They could work together, build something from scratch. It wouldn't be easy. It might not work. But it was a chance. Harold listened to Maya's plan, hearing the hope in her voice, the determination that reminded him of how he'd felt 40 years ago when he'd first opened his restaurant. He was old and tired and his knee hurt, but looking at Maya's face, seeing the fire in her eyes, he felt something shift. Maybe it was time to stop trying to reclaim his old life. Maybe it was time to build a new one. He told Maya, yes, they would try. And as they sat in that dusty storage unit, surrounded by the tools of his past, Harold felt that dangerous thing again. Hope. The next 6 weeks were a blur of permits and planning and problems that seemed insurmountable until they weren't. Maya threw herself into the logistics, using her organizational skills from nursing school to navigate the bureaucracy of food cart licensing. Harold spent his days experimenting with recipes, figuring out how to scale down his restaurant dishes for a mobile operation. They worked with a focused intensity, knowing they had a ticking clock and no backup plan. The eviction deadline was approaching, and they still had nowhere to live. But the food cart, at least, was taking shape. They found a used cart for sale from a failed taco business, purchased it with the money from selling Harold's storage equipment and Maya's saved paychecks. It needed work, but Harold discovered he could still fix things when he needed to. Maya proved surprisingly handy too, learning quickly, her younger body able to do the physical work that Harold's couldn't anymore. They became a team, complementing each other's skills, covering each other's weaknesses. Emma called again during this time, and for the first time in years, Harold had something real to tell her. He explained about Maya, about the food cart, about starting over. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, and Harold braced himself for judgment or disappointment. Instead, Emma said something unexpected. She was proud of him. She admitted she'd been avoiding him because she didn't know how to handle his decline, didn't know how to help. But this, what he was doing now, this was the dad she remembered. The conversation was still awkward, still careful, but it ended with Emma promising to visit when she could get time off work. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. Harold hung up with tears in his eyes, and Maya pretended not to notice. With 10 days left until eviction, they still hadn't found an apartment they could afford. They'd expanded their search radius to include neighborhoods farther out, places where Harold's car might actually survive. But even there, the options were limited and grim. They were running out of time and options. Then Maya found it. A garage apartment behind a house in a working-class neighborhood. It wasn't much, barely more than a studio with a separate bedroom, but it was clean, and the landlord, an elderly woman whose husband had recently died, seemed more interested in having good tenants than maximizing profit. She interviewed them together, asking pointed questions about their situation. Harold was honest, maybe too honest, explaining everything. The eviction, the food cart plan, his limited income, Maya's background. The landlord listened, studied them both, and then surprised them by saying yes. She'd been poor once herself, she explained. She knew what it was like to need a break. The rent was just barely manageable if they combined their incomes and if the food cart started generating revenue soon. They moved in 3 days before their eviction deadline, carrying their modest possessions up the outdoor stairs to their new home. It wasn't much, but standing in that empty apartment with Maya, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The food cart launched on a Saturday morning in early spring, parked on a corner near a busy transit station that Maya had scouted for foot traffic. They'd spent the previous night preparing, Harold teaching Maya the final details of his dumpling recipe, both of them working until their hands were sore. Now, as the morning commuters began to flow past, Harold stood at the cart window with Maya beside him and felt terror and excitement in equal measure. This was either going to work or it wasn't, and there was no safety net either way. The first customer was a young man in scrubs, probably heading home from a night shift at the hospital. He ordered dumplings skeptically, as if expecting disappointment. Harold watched him take the first bite, saw his expression change from doubt to surprise to something that looked like pleasure. The young man in scrubs came back 20 minutes later with 3 of his co-workers. Word spread. By lunchtime they had a line, not a huge line, but enough to keep them busy, enough to give them hope. Maya worked the register while Harold cooked, their system flowing smoothly despite it being their first day. They sold out by mid-afternoon, and when they counted the cash, they'd made enough to cover their expenses with a little left over. It wasn't success yet, but it wasn't failure. They went home exhausted and exhilarated, and Harold realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this alive. The weeks turned into months, and the food cart found its rhythm. They had regular customers now, people who came specifically for Harold's dumplings, who asked about his day, who treated him like a person rather than a service provider. Maya bloomed in the work, her natural warmth drawing customers in, her efficiency keeping things running smoothly. She'd gained weight, the healthy kind, no longer looking like someone barely surviving. Harold's knee still hurt, but he'd learned to work around it, and having a purpose made the pain more bearable. They fell into a routine, early mornings preparing food, days at the cart, evenings counting money and planning for tomorrow. They were making it work, not getting rich, but staying afloat, which felt like victory enough. Emma visited in June, flying in for a long weekend. She met Maya, saw the food cart, ate her father's dumplings for the first time in years. Harold watched his daughter and Maya talking and laughing together, and felt a lump in his throat. This makeshift family he'd stumbled into was more real than anything he'd had in years. Emma pulled him aside before she left, hugging him tightly, apologizing for her absence. Harold told her he understood, and maybe he finally did. Life was complicated, and people did the best they could with what they had. One evening in late summer, after a particularly good day at the cart, Harold and Maya sat on the steps outside their garage apartment, watching the sunset and eating leftover dumplings. Maya said something she'd been thinking about for a while. She wanted to go back to nursing school. She'd been saving money, researching financial aid, and she thought she could do it part-time while still working the cart. Harold encouraged her immediately, offering to adjust their schedule however she needed. As they sat there, this old man who'd once felt invisible and this young woman who'd once held a cardboard sign at a traffic light, Harold realized something profound. They'd both been drowning when they met, both convinced they were beyond saving. But somehow in reaching out to help each other, they'd both found solid ground. The traffic light had turned red that day, forcing Harold to stop, forcing him to see what he'd been trained to ignore. And in that moment of forced stillness, two lives had collided and created something neither could have built alone. Maya leaned her head on Harold's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and family that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Harold felt the weight of her trust, the responsibility and the gift of it. They'd started as strangers, connected only by circumstance and desperation. Now they were something else entirely, proof that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we stop to help. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow they'd wake up early and do it all again. Prepare food, serve customers, build their small business one dumpling at a time. It wasn't the life Harold had imagined at 63, and it wasn't the future Maya had planned at 26. But sitting there on those steps full of good food and hard-earned hope, it felt like exactly where they were meant to be. The city hummed around them, full of other people at other traffic lights, other moments of choice between stopping and driving on. Harold thought about all the times he'd looked away, all the years he'd spent invisible and making others invisible in return. He thought about that afternoon when the light turned red and something made him look up, really look, at the young woman with the cardboard sign. He thought about the decision to roll down his window, to gesture her over, to offer something more than money. It had seemed like such a small choice at the time, barely a choice at all, just an impulse he couldn't quite suppress. But small choices, Harold understood now, could redirect entire lives. A red light, a rolled-down window, a hesitant step toward a stranger's car. These tiny moments contained within them the seeds of transformation, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough or crazy enough to water them. Maya shifted beside him, and Harold heard her stomach growl despite the dumplings they'd just eaten. They both laughed, that easy laughter of people who'd seen each other at their worst and stuck around anyway. Maya announced she was going inside to make tea, asking if Harold wanted any. He said yes, and as she disappeared through their door, Harold stayed on the steps a moment longer. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he'd recently set as his wallpaper. Maya and him at the food cart, both sweaty and exhausted, and grinning like they'd won something. In a way they had. They'd won another day, another chance, another moment of mattering in a world that had tried very hard to convince them they didn't. Harold heard the kettle whistling inside and pushed himself up from the steps, his knee protesting as always. He'd take his medications tonight, the ones he could now afford because they were splitting expenses and making it work. He'd sleep in his small bedroom, knowing Maya was safe in hers, and tomorrow they'd start again. The simple, impossible, beautiful routine of building a life from ruins. As he reached for the door handle, Harold paused and looked back at the street, at the passing cars with their drivers focused on destinations, at the city that contained multitudes of stories just like his and Maya's. He thought about all the other traffic lights in this city, all the other moments of potential connection that would happen tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Most people would drive on. That was human nature, the instinct toward self-preservation and not getting involved. Harold had been one of those people for most of his life, and he couldn't judge anyone for making that choice. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone would stop. Someone would look. Someone would roll down their window and change the trajectory of two lives with a single gesture. Harold went inside to his tea and his makeshift family, and his hard-won second chance, grateful beyond words that he'd been that someone, on that day, at that traffic light. 6 months later, Harold stood at the food cart on a cold November morning, his breath making clouds in the crisp air. The cart had become a neighborhood fixture now, with loyal customers who came rain or shine. Maya was in class at the community college, having enrolled in nursing school the previous semester. Harold managed the cart alone on her school days, and though it was harder physically, he'd never felt more capable. The rhythm of the work had become second nature. The sizzle of dumplings hitting hot oil, the steam rising in fragrant clouds, the satisfaction of handing someone a warm meal on a cold day. A middle-aged woman approached the cart, someone Harold hadn't seen before. She ordered dumplings, and while Harold prepared them, she studied the cart, the menu. Harold himself with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. When he handed her the food, she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she asked how long he'd been in business. Harold told her about 8 months, wondering where this was going. The woman introduced herself as a food writer for a local magazine. She'd heard about the cart from multiple sources, all raving about the dumplings made by an older man who'd started over late in life. She wanted to do a story if Harold was interested. Harold's first instinct was to say no. He wasn't looking for attention or recognition. He just wanted to keep his head down and do the work. But then he thought about Maya, about how a story in a magazine might bring more customers, more stability, more opportunities for them to keep building this life they'd created. He thought about all the other people like him and Maya, invisible until they weren't, struggling until they found a way through. Maybe their story could matter to someone else. He said yes. The article came out 3 weeks later, a beautifully written piece about second chances and unlikely partnerships, and the power of stopping when the world told you to keep moving. It included a photo of Harold at the cart, his face showing every one of his 63 years, but also showing something else. Contentment, purpose, peace. The day the article dropped, their line tripled. Harold called Maya in a panic, and she skipped her afternoon class to come help. They worked side by side, barely able to keep up with demand, exhausted and overwhelmed and strangely elated. Among the new customers was a woman Harold recognized immediately, even though he hadn't seen her in person in almost 2 years. Emma had flown in from Seattle without telling him, wanting to surprise him to see the cart on its busiest day. She waited in line like everyone else, and when she reached the window, Harold couldn't stop the tears that came. His daughter ordered dumplings, tried them, and declared them even better than she remembered. She stayed the whole afternoon, helping where she could, meeting Maya properly, becoming part of the chaos and the success. That evening, after they'd finally sold out and closed up the cart, the three of them sat in Harold and Maya's small apartment, exhausted and happy. Emma announced she'd been thinking about moving back to the city. Her job could be done remotely, and she'd realized she wanted to be closer to family. She looked at Harold when she said family, but her eyes included Maya too. Harold felt something complete in that moment, some circle closing that he hadn't known was open. Maya was talking about her classes, about a particularly difficult anatomy exam she'd aced, her voice animated with the confidence that comes from knowing you're on the right path. Emma was telling them about Seattle, about her apartment with the view of the water, about feeling disconnected from everything that mattered. And Harold sat between these two women who'd both come back to him in different ways and felt a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. The conversation eventually turned to the future, to possibilities. Emma suggested they think about expanding, maybe adding a second cart or even a small permanent location. Maya worried about overextending, about losing what made the cart special. Harold listened to them debate, these two people he loved, planning a future that included him, and realized he had an opinion too. He'd been so used to letting life happen to him, to being passive in the face of circumstances, that having agency again felt strange and wonderful. He told them he wanted to keep the cart as it was for now, to stay small and manageable, to focus on quality rather than expansion. He'd learned the hard way that bigger wasn't always better, that sometimes the right size was the one that let you sleep at night. Emma and Maya both nodded, respecting his wisdom, and the conversation shifted to easier topics. They ordered pizza because no one had the energy to cook, and they stayed up late talking and laughing. 3 people who might have never known each other if not for a red light and a choice and a willingness to risk hoping again. Later, after Emma had left for her hotel and Maya had gone to bed, Harold stood at his small kitchen window looking out at the street below. A car passed, its headlights cutting through the darkness, heading somewhere urgent or nowhere in particular. Harold thought about the driver, wondered what their story was, whether they were happy or struggling or somewhere in between. He thought about all the invisible people in this city, the ones society had trained everyone to look past. The homeless veterans and the aging poor and the young people drowning in circumstances beyond their control. There were so many of them, and most would stay invisible, would slip through the cracks, would never get their chance at redemption. It made Harold angry and sad in equal measure. He couldn't save everyone. He'd only been able to save one person, and even that was probably giving himself too much credit since Maya had done as much saving as he had. But maybe, Harold thought, that was enough. Maybe all anyone could do was stop at their own traffic light, help their own stranger, create their own small ripple in the vast ocean of human suffering. Maybe if enough people did that, the ripples would add up to something like change. It was a hopeful thought, possibly naive, but Harold held on to it anyway. Hope had served him well these past months, even when it had seemed foolish. He finished his tea and went to bed, setting his alarm for the early hour that had become routine. Tomorrow there would be dumplings to make and customers to serve and a life to continue building. Tomorrow Maya would go to her classes and come back smiling about what she'd learned. Tomorrow Emma would stop by the cart before her flight back to Seattle, and they'd start planning her move back home. Tomorrow was full of small certainties and large possibilities, and Harold Chen, once invisible, once defeated, once sure his best days were behind him, was eager to meet it. The seasons changed, and the food cart changed with them. Harold developed warm soups for winter, light rolls for summer, always keeping his signature dumplings as the foundation. Maya graduated from the community college nursing program with honors, and while she looked for nursing positions, she continued working the cart. She'd discovered she loved the intersection of caring for people and feeding them, and she'd started talking about maybe someday opening a place that combined both. Healthy food for people recovering from illness, meals designed with nutrition and healing in mind. It was a dream that would take time and money and luck, but Harold encouraged it because he understood the power of having something to work toward. Emma did move back to the city, finding an apartment within walking distance of the cart. She became a regular fixture during her lunch breaks, and sometimes she'd bring colleagues who'd become new customers. The relationship between father and daughter was still healing, still careful in places, but it was real and growing stronger. They'd both learned that families could fracture and mend, that love could survive long silences if there was will on both sides to bridge them. One spring afternoon, almost 2 years after that first meeting at the traffic light, Maya brought someone to the cart. A young man, also in scrubs, who she introduced as James. He worked at the hospital where Maya had started her new nursing job, and from the way they looked at each other, Harold understood immediately. He felt the complicated mix of emotions that comes with watching someone you care about find their own path. Happiness for them, mixed with awareness that things would change again. But change, Harold had learned, wasn't always loss. Sometimes it was just evolution. James became a regular at the cart too, and Harold got to know him. A kind man, a dedicated nurse, someone who treated Maya with the respect and care she deserved. One evening, the four of them had dinner together at Harold and Maya's apartment. Harold, Maya, James, and Emma. They cooked together, laughed together, told stories about their days. It struck Harold that this was his family now, this collection of people brought together by circumstance and choice and determination. Not the family he'd been born into, or even the one he'd created with Margaret, but a family nonetheless. Real and messy and imperfect, and his. The food cart continued to thrive, becoming an institution in the neighborhood. Harold hired 2 part-time workers to help during busy periods, providing jobs for people who needed them, remembering what it was like to need a chance. He trained them the way he'd trained Maya, with patience and care, passing on not just recipes, but the philosophy that food was love made edible, that serving people was an honor, not a burden. Maya moved in with James after a year of dating, and while Harold missed her constant presence, he was proud of her for building her own life. She still worked the cart on weekends, insisting she wasn't ready to give it up completely. The cart had been her salvation too, and she couldn't quite let it go. Harold understood. Some things weren't meant to be let go, just integrated into whatever came next. On the 3rd anniversary of their first meeting, Maya showed up at the cart with a surprise. She'd found the cardboard sign she'd been holding that day, the one that had said, "Anything helps, God bless." She'd kept it all this time, folded in a box with other mementos of her hardest days. She'd had it framed, and now she presented it to Harold as a gift. The sign hung on the wall of the cart from that day forward, a reminder of where they'd started, of how far they'd come, of the thin line between desperation and hope. Customers sometimes asked about it, and Harold would tell them the story or parts of it. He'd become comfortable sharing his journey, understanding that vulnerability was strength, that his story might matter to someone else struggling with their own traffic light moment.